Hello, today's video is about Eva Smith in Priestley's And Inspector Calls, arguably the most important character but the one who's accorded the least respect and sort of care in the whole of the play. These videos, and I have others for other key characters in the play, are all designed to give you very quick overview of some key quotes so that you can put those into your essays. I'm Zoe Sophie from Past English GCSE. You can check out my YouTube channel. I've got lots of videos on And Inspector Calls and other literature texts and some language questions too. So in the class hierarchy we see that Eva Smith, also known as Daisy Renton, that's the other name that she changes her name to after losing her job at Millward's, she is lower class. Now, I've kind of tweaked this class hierarchy diagram, and you'll know this from my other videos where I've presented this too. I've actually just put her a little bit lower than the parlourmaid Edna. There is a video on Edna too. Please feel free to check that out. But I would say Eva Smith is arguably sort of in the pecking order, so to speak. Although they're both lower class, Edna has the sort of comfort of being permanently employed. Eva Smith does not. Hence this is why sort of she bins her name and changes it to Daisy Renton with a hope to actually get permanent employment and shore up her position in life. Unfortunately she doesn't, and this explains why she's really at the bottom of the hierarchy. Quote number 1. Now these are all quotes about her. She doesn't really get to speak directly for obvious reasons. She's committed suicide. So this is the inspector in Act 1. He says, "She was still Eva Smith when Mr Birling sacked her, but after that she stopped being Eva Smith. Perhaps she'd had enough of it." So we know that she changes her name. And if you look at her name, it's really interesting. Her name is an aptronym. I do talk about this in some of my other videos as well, but apt means suitable. Nym means name. Now Eva sounds very like Eve, so think of the biblical connotations of her being fallen woman. Eve eats the apple that the serpent tempts her with, and Eden is never the same again. And Smith is a very common surname. And there's a reason why her name has been Smith, or why Priestley has given her this name. And it sort of comes out in the inspector's Millions and Millions speech, which I speak about in my video on the inspector. Please feel free to check that video out too. But Smith is a really common surname. Why has she got a common surname? Because there's lots like her. There's lots of people who are lower class, just like Eva Smith, who are in the same position as her, who face the same struggles as her, and that's the whole reason her name is what it is. I'll talk about Daisy Renton later. It's got different connotations, but you should know this is an aptronym. And the inspector, she was still Eva Smith when Mr Birling sacked her, but after that she'd stopped being Eva Smith. Perhaps she'd had enough of it. So, sort of looking at this, it looks like an identity crisis of sorts. She's still Eva Smith. Is this just about, number 1, the name change? Or is this about possibly her losing herself? When she lost her job as a lower class female, she really needed that job to keep her from starving, from having no shelter, from not having her basic needs, met. So therefore, we could argue it could be both of these. So she changes her name, as I said, to Daisy Renton later on. Daisies, we sort of think of them as a flower that kind of can withstand a lot. So we think of it as resilience, or connoting resilience. Look at daisies. There's sort of quite a lot of interesting information about them. But Renton sounds like the word rent. She does, it's alleged, it looks like she goes into prostitution later on. She's found in the Palace Bar by Gerald Croft. And that is a place that is associated with women who are selling themselves to men. So there's connotations with that name as well. Moving on. Quote 2, also from the inspector in Act 1, there's the stage direction, and I do keep talking about how these are important. So he delivers this steadily. That's what I was thinking earlier tonight when I was looking at what was left of Eva Smith. A nice little promising life there, and a nasty mess somebody's made of it. So this language, as I've mentioned in my video on the inspector, is quite visceral. Visceral means emotional. Visceral language. He sounds angry. His tone is angry. And you've got the intensifier to make more of. Nasty, well, it's an adjective really, but intensifier, nasty mess. Describing it as a mess. So that'd be the adjective, the description. I know mess can be a noun as well, but intensifier, adjective, nasty mess, somebody's made of it. It's very, particularly the part somebody's made of it, is quite accusatory in nature too. You can say it's accusatory language. What was left of Eva Smith, so it makes it sound like there's remnants of her. That, again, it links to quote number 1, this sort of loss of her identity, that she is no more. A nice little promising life there. Adjective, promising, contrast with mess. Somebody's made of it. And the nature in which this is written sort of sounds like it's not Eva that's being accused of making a mess of it, it's someone else. So it's very accusatory here. Quote 3. This is from Gerald in Act 2. I couldn't get any exact details from her about herself. She wanted to be Daisy Renton and not Eva Smith. So there's an element of mystery here. I couldn't get any exact details. She's being evasive with him. I mean, she doesn't want to commit. She doesn't want to reveal anything. She's being a bit sort of secretive or furtive here. She wanted to be Daisy Renton. We talked about Daisy sort of being resilient and Renton, connotations of rent, and not Eva Smith, because I guess particularly after Mills that name has been wrecked. The reputation there's gone. And if you watch my context video where I talk about Edwardian etiquette, you'll see the importance of names and the importance of reputation there. And once your reputation was besmirched, that was it. So she needed this new name. She wanted to be Daisy Renton. So again, this is another atronym. All right, these are techniques. Wanted. So we've got past tense verb, connotes desire, hope. Because when she was with Gerald, although it was a short time, it was arguably when she was at her happiest. And she could, although she didn't reveal very much about herself, she did reveal that she had some sort of desires and hopes and dreams. She wanted to be Daisy Renton, and Daisy Renton could be with him for as long as possible. So I think that's quite revealing in Act 2. Remember, when you write your essays, try to plan to use quotes from the beginning, middle and end of the play. The examiner likes that. It's also good for you to be able to sort of track the chronology of the character and see how they develop to you. Quote number 4 from Mrs Birling, a very telling quote, and this is also referenced in my Mrs Birling video. If you haven't watched that, check it out. She says, and in any case, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class. It's an incredibly derogatory quote. It's so rude. It's so offensive. It's nasty in nature. There's a nasty tone here. There's something quite dismissive too. Girls of that class. Pejorative. And I think I've said this before in my video about her. It's very pejorative language. It's very classist. It likens Ava to being sort of like an alien. I don't suppose for a moment we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Notice she calls her the girl. She doesn't label. It's a label. She doesn't use her name. So it's quite disrespectful in nature. Because she's omitted her name. The girl. That class. Girls of that class. It's very dismissive. It's very classist. It's typical Mrs Birling, but it also shows you another perspective of the lower class, particularly held by, and notice she is slightly higher class than her husband. She said, it says at the beginning, at the early stage directions. I also did a video looking at the opening stage directions in Act 1. That is a very thorough video. So if you haven't watched that, please check that out. But it does say next to her that she's her husband's social superior. So she is arguably higher up in the class hierarchy than Mr Birling. She's just down from Mr Croft, Gerald Croft and the Crofts, Lord and Lady Croft. So it's quite telling that that's her view of Ava. I don't suppose we can understand for a moment. I'm not even going to think about it for a moment because Eva Smith is not important. That's what she's saying. Final quote from the inspector. Notice the inspector talks about Ava a lot because the inspector, as you'll probably already appreciate, and as I mentioned in my video about the inspector, he is Priestley's mouthpiece. You'll have heard your teacher say this before as well. The inspector talks about Eva a lot because she is his concern. She's lower class and he's advocating for the lower classes. Well, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm and you can't do her any good now either. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. So this is incredibly negative in tone. It's quite didactic in nature. I've mentioned this word before as well. Didactic means it's sort of preaching or teaching or telling someone how to think. She's gone. You can't do her any more harm. So look at the connotations of harm. It kind of connotes violence. It connotes something that's unpleasant, that's nasty, that's dangerous. And you can't do her any good now either. In other words, it's over. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. And I think here it's a really strong hint to the audience and to the Birlings that you should be sorry. It's a very strong hint. He's preaching here. So it's quite important to note that. And it's clear that the inspector and Priestley himself believe that the lower class deserve an apology from people who have gone out of their way to harm them by sacking them unnecessarily, by ditching them, by impregnating them, by raping them, by not affording them a fair hearing for help. It's quite telling. So to summarise then, Eva is lower class. We're aware of this. She's hapless. If you haven't heard this adjective before, the word is in Blake's London, the hapless soldier's sigh. You'll have heard it there. It means unlucky. And Eva Smith is very unlucky. Not only is she raped by Eric, she becomes pregnant by him. She loses her job twice. She has no family to rely on. So these things that happen to her cost her more than the average person because she doesn't have a support network. I'm going to write that there. No support network. No family, no money to call on for bad times. And that links to this word, adjective. She is vulnerable as a result of that because she's a woman on her own in 1912, a time where there's no great support network in terms of benefits, healthcare. There's nothing like that, really. Yet she is defiant because she initiates the strike. She clearly believes she's worth more money and she is the ringleader. So she's obviously quite spirited. Defiant means to kind of fight back, to argue. And she does against Birling. She's also desperate though, particularly when she asks Mrs Birling for help. And it's refused. So she's desperate at that point, pregnant and alone and vulnerable. She's isolated, as I've said, no family, no one, no support network, leaves her on her own. All of these three, particularly hapless, vulnerable and isolated, and desperate actually for, link together quite closely. She is attractive. Gerald likes her, Eric likes her. She's described as such. I think she's pretty. And actually so does Sheila, because Sheila gets jealous. So she's seen as attractive for sure. She's victimised. Now put this arguably, particularly Mrs Birling, because not only does Mrs Birling not want to hear her case, but she ensures that the other members of the committee don't hear her case either. So I would argue that's victimisation, because she's not just refusing, she's getting others to refuse too. So it's sort of like gaining up on her. There is she's victimised there. Last but not by no means least, Eva Smith's muted. Notice how there's no real direct speech. The closest we get to direct speech, and I didn't include it in my quotes, but if you want a sixth one, she makes reference in her diary when things end with Gerald. She goes to the sea to think about things to try to make it last longer. There's a reference in there if you look over, and that is reported speech through the inspector who's read her diary. And obviously Gerald reports some things she said and Mr Birling reports things she's done, but she doesn't have a voice. Even Edna, in my video on Edna, I talk about this, where Edna does directly speak, albeit just to say, please sir, an inspector's called. Ava doesn't even get that. She doesn't get any direct speech. She gets reported speech or reported actions. She is silenced. I guess that's her oppression that is presented by Priestley through the fact that she doesn't get to speak. So she is muted as a character. However, she is very important the whole play, so centered around what's happened to her, who is to blame, partly to blame, helped her in her demise. So she is important in terms of the play, but in terms of the hierarchy and in terms of her power, she's powerless and she's muted. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. Please feel free to comment if you've got any more thoughts on Eva Smith. I'd be really interested to see what you think about her. If you think there's any other quotes that should be mentioned, please put them in the comments. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out as well. Thank you for watching.